British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will release further details of his plan to reopen the economy. A widely anticipated speech has prompted more questions than answers. Mr. Johnson says his government is replacing its main stay-at-home slogan with Stay Alert. He says while the lockdown won't end yet, some people would be encouraged to return to work. Under new rules, people from different households will be allowed to meet in a park, but only if they stay 2 meters apart. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Ollie Barrett from London. Ollie, to work or not to work? Why the confusion? And it looks like Mr. Johnson's Foreign Secretary is also adding to the mix.
Yeah, certainly some confusing messages coming from the government at times. What Boris Johnson is saying is that if you can't work from home and you can go to work in a workplace that can be made safe in a safe distancing way, then you should indeed go to work. But he also says you should avoid public transport if you can. Well, that's not very easy in a big city like London, for example. So plenty of workers wondering about how exactly to follow this advice. The reason they're getting this advice is that the government does want to try and encourage sections of the economy to start reopening if they can do so in a safe way. And the government also believes there have been quite a lot of companies and workplaces that have shut down during the lockdown period when actually the rules and regulations didn't require that they did. So they're trying to get some of those to reopen once more. And yes, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab appearing to add to the confusion earlier today when asked about those rules about who you can meet up with in the park, for example. He said that you could meet up with one or more of your parents. Well, then Downing Street then came out and said, actually, no, if you're going to meet up with your parents in the park, you can only meet up with one of them at a time, and you have to remain 2 meters away from them. Well, that leads a lot of people to ask why they have to choose between parents if they're going to meet up with them in open outdoor spaces. So certainly the government does need to get the details nailed down of all of this as it starts to release them over the coming hours, and we'll hear from Boris Johnson in Parliament as well.
OK, so can we expect more clarity then from the guidance document that the government is issuing later?
The government will certainly attempt to clarify some of this. I think one of the real difficulties, and we heard this phrase from Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, earlier, is that the government really does want to try and encourage some common sense from British people, but that does necessarily mean that you are going to get, a lack of direction sometimes. People are going to be asked to try and follow the regulations, but interpret them in a sensible way so that we don't see huge crowds of people congregating in parks and what have you. But at the same time, the scientific advice here is that actually the virus does spread much less in outdoor spaces, and the government does want to encourage people to go into the parks and exercise as often as possible to try and maintain some level of public health at a very difficult time otherwise.
Yeah, they also closely watched today. Premier League clubs will come together to discuss how to finish the football season. It's going to be quite complicated, though, isn't it?
All sorts of reasons why it's going to be incredibly complicated. We do expect that the government this week will say that Premier League clubs can resume group training with very strict protocols in place. Up to now, only individual training has been allowed. But even once that gets going, it's very difficult to move it to the next step. And then in terms of the league, if football clubs are going to potentially play in neutral venues, that is a very controversial idea, particularly with some of those clubs down at the bottom of the Premier League at the moment. They are worried about the impact that might have on their fortunes. And so, real complicated issues for the clubs to try and sort out. There is not yet agreement about how exactly to play out the rest of the Premier League season. So lots still to be agreed, which does raise the prospect, if there isn't going to be agreement in the end of the season, having to be cancelled at some point. But I think the Premier League does want to avoid that if possible. Generally, there is a consensus around the idea that finishing this season is the way to go if possible.
Indeed, thanks for that update. Ollie Barrett speaking to us in London. Once again, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to reveal more details of a plan to reopen the economy.